Moses, what a great guy, right? And even in our contemporary culture, people still refer to Moses, and in some cultures around the world, elevate him more than in other places. But there's something iconic about him because of the story of his birth, because of the thing he's known for. Really, two things. One is getting the children of Israel out of Egypt into the promised land. And two, the Ten Commandments, going up on Mount Sinai. And you look at this guy and you think, wow, what a hero, what a great guy. Except he wasn't. Because he struggled like you and I do. And yes, God used him in incredible ways. But the story of Moses, really, if we look at the text in the whole story of his life, is a story of God's grace working with a guy who is extraordinarily inadequate. And yet God used him. And I find amazing comfort and encouragement in that. That if God can use Moses, he can use me. It's like the pastor that Sharon and I attended his church, Don Howard, when we were first married, and I was still in seminary. And he told this story, he would frequently tell the story of Samson, who went and he killed a bunch of Philistines using the jawbone of a donkey. And he would say, if the Lord can use the jawbone of and then he'd use the King James Version word for donkey, then he can use anybody. And Moses is very much the same thing. If God can use Moses, then God can use us, because it's not about our respective talents or abilities or knowledge or whatever. It is about God taking his people and using them to accomplish his purposes. So in chapter 3, verse 11, as God is confronting Moses and saying, I want you to do this amazing thing, Moses says to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And then there's some more dialogue that takes place as Moses kind of resists. And then in chapter 4, God puts his foot down, metaphorically, and he says in verse 11, so it's easy to remember, chapter 3, verse 11, and chapter 4, verse 11, the Lord said to him, who gave man his mouth? And who makes him deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? And the contextual impact of that for Moses, who was arguing with God, oh, I'm not eloquent, I can't do this, I can't do that. And finally God says, enough. If I am God, and I am, then you can do this thing because I will be with you. And we are going to look at some of those specific stories as we go through the life of Moses. But to give a little backstory, we need to understand the book of Exodus, where we're going to spend the majority of our time, in general. We need to have this bigger picture, because Moses' story is not recorded for us just as a series of inspirational messages, like Aesop's fables. Moses' historical data, his autobiography, since he's the one who wrote the book of Exodus, is intended to communicate to us something about the theology of God, the nature of his created order, and our role within that order and relationship with that God. But unlike the Apostle Paul, he does not do it through dogmatic, systematic theology, where Paul uses all the big words, the ones that I like imputation and propitiation, one of my favorite words. That's not in the vocabulary of Moses, but rather Moses tells a story. And he starts in Genesis 1. So Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And collectively, as a set, they are known as the law, Torah, even though the actual law as a code really is only in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But Genesis gives us a fuller backdrop, starting with creation, God being the creator of all things, which is important for us to understand, because if God is creator, He is owner, and if God is owner, then he is accomplishing his purposes, even in the time of the oppression of the Israelites and ultimately their exodus. But within the book of Exodus itself and the story of Moses, we need to take one step back before we look at him individually and understand how he is trying to communicate to his original audience, the Israelites, who were going to go into the promised land, who their God is. They lived in crises, the Israelites. And we have documented for us at the beginning of Exodus, in the first chapter, the crises of slavery. But the reality is, when Moses is telling this story, when he's sitting around, they're in the wilderness because they have disobeyed God and not gone into the promised land based on the instructions God had given to them. So they got 40 years wandering around in the wilderness. Undoubtedly, they would have campfires out in front. Well, I say undoubtedly. This is my sanctified imagination. Undoubtedly, they had campfires out in front of their tent at night. And they would say, hey, Moses, do you want to come over for a campfire? And so he would show up and they'd say, tell us again the story. And Moses would tell the story over and over again, how God brought them out of slavery and was preparing for them to go into the promised land. But the point of telling that story was not simply to give them history. It was to give them theology of who this God is, that they should worship and serve and honor and have exclusive dependence on when they go into the promised land. Because they had just spent 400 years in Egypt as slaves, and it's undoubted that the culture of the gods of Egypt heavily influenced their understanding of God's created order. So let's just do a quick look through Exodus. I was going to say Ezekiel. Where did that come from? Exodus chapter 1, to set a backstory for everything that we will see in the life of Moses. In Exodus 1, it begins with the story of the Israelites, the Hebrews, being oppressed. And right from the very beginning, we see a contrast between the God of Israel, who is the King of Kings, and the king of Egypt, who fancied himself a deity, and all of the gods of Egypt. A great contrast is established, and this is critical to understanding the entire story of Moses. These refugee descendants of Jacob are living in Egypt because of the famine. We see that happening at the end of the book of Genesis. And they start out with 70 people, Jacob's family and Joseph and his brothers, and they move into Egypt, 70 of them. But they become so powerful, they begin to intimidate the Egyptians. So in Exodus chapter 1, verse 7, it says, "But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly." Why is that? There's just a little hint here that the promise God made to Abraham is being fulfilled. And yet fulfilling that promise also brings great stress and unwanted consequences. The blessing of God creates for them a challenging environment. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so the whole land was filled with them. And the Egyptians are looking around saying, now wait a minute, we have a problem here. And then the very next verse, verse 8, we have this little hint of a problem yet to come. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Joseph was a hero amongst the Egyptians. He had been sold into slavery, raised through the ranks. God gave him a vision that there was going to be famine. Through a whole bunch of setbacks and a very convoluted path, eventually he becomes prime minister of Egypt, and he sets about planning for the famine, and the nation of Egypt and many of the other peoples around Egypt are saved because of Joseph and his planning. So he becomes a hero in Egyptian politics. And yet there arises this new king who does not know about Joseph. And so he doesn't care about that history, and he's going to oppress these people who, for some unknown reason, just seem to multiply like rabbits. And it's overwhelming the population, and they are threatened. In verse 12, it says, there's a little bit of a story there of oppression. Then in verse 12, the more the Egyptians oppressed the Israelites, the more they multiplied and they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So there's an increasing tension. And as we look at the story of Moses, we have to remember this important detail, that the book of Exodus is written as a narrative. It's written as one big story. And so there are plots and subplots, and there are characters that play off each other. And we need to understand it as this work of literature if we're to understand the message Moses is trying to communicate to us. So the oppression grows. We see this heightened tension, this heightened crisis, a heightened conflict between the Hebrews and the Egyptians. And over and over and over again, the more they try to put the Hebrews down, the more productive they become in terms of their population. So an edict is given that all the Egyptian boys that are born are to be killed. And in verse 17 it says, "But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live." So here's again a little nuance, just a little hint about people who fear God, who honor God, who obey God, and put themselves at risk, and yet God redeems that situation. It's a theme we're going to see repeated over and over and over again about fearing God, obeying God, in spite of the consequences. Because God is the one creating this crisis. He's the one blessing them, making them a strong group of people as a subculture within the Egyptian culture. Well, the king finds out what they're doing, but they're not intimidated. Verses 20 and 21, God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong, and because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. So despite the best efforts of the king of Egypt, these group of Hebrews just keep on growing. It's like rabbits out of control. Verse 22, then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." So there's this planned genocide. And we know the story of Moses and his birth. We're going to look at that in detail next week, how God saved Moses in a very supernatural event. And, well, if you don't know the story, come back next week, you'll learn about it. If you know, you can kind of begin connecting the dots. But the whole point is from chapter 1, there's a crisis being established where the king of Egypt is against the king of the heavens and the earth. This is not just a local thing that's happening in the land of Egypt, but as Moses tells the story, he is setting it up as a conflict that's going to happen between one who presumes himself to be king over all things and the one who is king over all things. And that line at the very beginning in verse 8 is significant. There arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, because early in the book of Exodus, as the Hebrews suffer under this slavery and their cries go out to God, it says, "And God remembered his people." And it stands in direct contrast to verse 8. This is part of that literary structure that makes up this narrative that tells us the story, not simply as history, but as theology. That there arose a king in Egypt who was ignorant, who didn't know the past, who forgot who these people were. And yet the blessing of God that made them so prosperous also brought upon themselves, or was the cause of them becoming persecuted. And when they cried out, their king, their God, remembered them. And this contrasting is a tool used by Moses as he writes the narrative of the entire book of Exodus to help the reader, to help the one sitting around the campfire as Moses told them these stories, to remember, be sure your faith is aligned and is loyal to the proper source of authority. Choose your king carefully. The midwives did, And it resulted in protecting Moses' life. And not only protecting Moses' life, but then then the midwives themselves becoming the mothers of children, which was the ultimate demonstration of God's blessing upon them in their mindset. So what do we do with this thing called the book of Exodus? How are we going to contextualize the life of Moses in the story? Well, as I said, it is written by Moses, and it's autobiographical. So when you read through it and you see the story of Moses and his weaknesses exposed, it demonstrates for us a man who is incredibly humble and honest and willing to allow his foibles to be known by others. And part of that clearly is the work of the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, so that what Moses wrote would be exactly what God wanted written. But nonetheless, to expose yourself, your vulnerabilities, the way Moses does, speaks volumes to what he had learned, not because he was innately born with this phenomenal character. He was a star character person, like we have some people born that are phenomenal athletes. And you get them out there on the curling sheet, and after throwing three stones, they're taking out stones and doing double raises and all kinds of stuff. And it's like, this is your first time playing this? Yeah, or you play, no, I've never been on ice before. And it drives you crazy, and you think it's not fair. How can these people play the game? Anyway, that's a rant for another day. This kind of character that Moses demonstrates is not like being a star athlete with natural ability, that he's naturally humble, he's naturally effective for God. This is the result of a lifetime of learning, of making mistakes, of getting angry and being corrected, and willing, above all else, over a process of time, to learn to trust God. And the humility we see in the book of Exodus is astounding, because he puts it all out there, even when he is not cast in the best of light. Throughout this story, the story of the book of Exodus, the narrative in the book of Exodus, which, by the way, even though I use words like it's narrative, it's a story, let me be clear, this is also historical. This stuff actually happened. Moses was a real guy who lived in a real place, who was used by a real God. It was 1,500 years, more or less, before Christ was born. But it's not just a spiritual myth or a great legacy that has been passed on that somebody made up. This is history. So as we look at this narrative, as we look at this story, like any good storyteller, there are creative elements that are used consistently to help communicate the message. There are the Israelites, who start out in a position of unbelieving because they've had 400 years of oppression and being under the Egyptian culture, and undoubtedly some of them had to be worshiping the gods of Egypt. They did not have a great knowledge of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and of the promise until the crisis hits. And their only hope of escape is to cry out to the Creator God and ask Him for relief, and He remembers them and He answers them. So the Hebrews, the Israelites, who struggle throughout the story of Exodus, and in fact the entire history of the people of Israel, but especially here in these first 5 books, as Moses records it, is a story of people who struggle to believe. They have their highs. They finally go through the Exodus, and they make it out past the Egyptians, and Moses splits the water, and they walk through, and all of that stuff happens, and they have a great celebration, and they do what you and I do. I will never doubt God again. Never. And then a few days later, they're hungry, and they're tired, and they got no food, and what do? They grumble. Moses, why'd you bring us out here to die? We were better off in Egypt. Let's go back to Egypt. And this is the struggle of the people of God, because we live in a broken world, and this is a story about learning to move from unbelief to belief. There are in this story, in this narrative, the Egyptians who defy God and ultimately pay the price for that. And there's a confrontation between the God of heaven and the gods of Egypt. And the 10 plagues that Moses uses to convince Pharaoh. Well, it's God who convinces him, but there's this demonstration of Moses' power using 10 plagues. Each one of those plagues was specifically directed towards one of the gods of Egypt to demonstrate that the God of heaven, the God of the Hebrews, was greater than each one of these gods that the Egyptians worshipped. So there's this contrast in who is the greatest God. Then, of course, there's Moses himself, and a reminder of, as being a leader of the people of God, a reminder of the connection with Abraham. In Genesis 12, God made a promise to Abraham. He said, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you will all the families of the earth be blessed." And then in verse 7, "And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And he built an altar there to the Lord who appeared to him." So there's this great promise given to Abraham, and they don't see its reality. They're slaves. Where's our land? Where's our promise of blessing? Who is this God? And Moses connects himself very much with Abraham as this is the means by which God is going to fulfill his promise, this covenant promise that he made as we move into this new land. So Moses documents all these events under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, not to elevate himself as a great spiritual leader, but to demonstrate the process that God uses and the reality of what it is to live in a broken world and to struggle, and how sin distorts our perspective and confuses us, and yet how God is always faithful. We tend to have high expectations of God, and we come to Scripture and we say, "This is what you said, God. Why isn't this happening?" Well, the Israelites were exactly the same. "This is what you said to Abraham, God. Why isn't this happening?" And the life of Moses and the story of Exodus help us put all of that into a larger context, that God is working. His purposes will be accomplished, even though, and ironically, in the story of the Hebrews, the problem of their slavery was caused by the blessing of God making them reproduce like rabbits. And that blessing ultimately became a threat and the source of their slavery, but it was through that they finally called out to God. And unlike the God of Egypt, or the king of Egypt, who forgot about Joseph, the king of heaven, the king of the Hebrews, hears them, listens to them, and begins a process of redemption. So obviously, the other major part of this narrative is God himself, the I am God, the one who is faithful to his people and to his covenant. And unlike the gods of Egypt, that Israel had spent 400 years in that culture, exposed to their theology and their way of doing things, the gods and the system of polytheism, gods represented by creation, by frogs and by water and by all kinds of things that the 10 plagues addressed. The God of Israel is not part of the creation, but is the creator. And he is personal, and he is knowable, and he is relational. And just think about how amazing it must have been for Moses to say, "The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the creator of heaven and earth, has talked to me and has told me we are going to leave behind all of this and walk into the promised land that God guaranteed to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Is it any wonder that in chapter 3 of Exodus, Moses says to God, "They're not going to believe me. They're going to think I'm a lunatic. How can I possibly do this?" And then there's that whole process where God, does the miracles with the rod and all that stuff. But we can't throw stones at Moses, because if I came here next Sunday and I said, "God spoke to me and he told me," and then I made some great I don't know, I can't even think of anything. We're all going to become beekeepers of the largest hives in North America or something like that. That's beyond our comprehension. It just makes no sense. You would be looking at me and then afterwards taking Sharon aside and saying, is Graham okay? Did he have like a mini stroke? Is he eating well? Is he resting well? It would just seem bizarre, right? So why would their environment be any different? It wasn't. So they would have thought that his message was craziness. And yet the God of heaven remembers them, and then it just kicks off a whole series of events to convince and show not just the Egyptians, but Israel themselves, the Hebrews, that God in heaven is the creator of heaven and earth. And the person he chose to lead them out is the most unlikely candidate. He was a murderer. He had killed an Egyptian. He was angry. He didn't have really great communication skills, and he says, no, not me, God. I get stressed in public speaking. Look at my palms, they're sweating. And God says, all right. Aaron, help him out. Well, it worked, but it was just an excuse. The most unlikely guy. So what do we learn then? What can we look forward to learning about the life of Moses, or through the life of Moses, in this book of Exodus? This is like an orientation guide to understanding this story. First, about God. We're going to learn three things. We're going to observe three things. One, God is attentive to what is happening in his creation. This is not the God of the Egyptians. This is not whatever other thing people today may put their faith in. Everybody is a person of faith. All of us have our faith in something, that this is what's going to give me meaning and purpose and value and fulfill my expectations. The book of Exodus tells us that the object of our faith, if it's the living God, we understand this God is attentive to what is happening in his creation. In chapter 2, verses 23 to 25, during those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. So this is the king that had forgotten about Joseph. And here he's dead. So the contrast, I hope it's obvious. Here's a king who forgot versus a God who doesn't forget. Here's a king who died versus a God who never dies. He forgot, or he died, and the people cried out because of their slavery. They cried for rescue from slavery, came up to God, and God heard their groaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel, and God knew their distress. This is the God of Exodus. This is the God of Q50. Today, we worship the same God. This isn't just a story from 3,500 years ago in a religion that's old and dusty. It's the same God today. That blows my mind. It just gives me goosebumps. That it's the same God we're worshiping. And this God, he's attentive to what's happening in his creation. And secondly, even though this is Old Testament, he is a God of grace. In chapter 16, verse 12, it says, I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. God talking to Moses. Say to them, at twilight, tonight, you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. The people were grumbling about, we have nothing to eat. We don't have any, and later on they would grumble about what they were eating. But right now it's like, we don't have enough food, and they're complaining and grumbling. God hears them and responds in grace. He doesn't condemn them and say, would you just shut up? We've all been in those car trips, right? When the kids are in the back, it's a long drive. As a kid, I remember there was no air conditioning. My sister and I, my parents had a small Toyota Corolla with a tent trailer on the back. We were hauling across Canada to go to the West Coast. And it was hot and it was sticky and the windows were down, and we had a cassette player that kind of played, right? And on those hot, long days across Saskatchewan where there's nothing to look at, And my sister and I would just be mad at each other, and mom and dad were trying to keep the peace. It's like, would you please just be quiet? Here, eat this. It'll give your mouth something to do. God doesn't do that. He says, I have heard your grumbling, and I am going to provide for you. Not so you'll shut up, but so you will know that I am Yahweh, the God of Israel, your God. And then through this story in the life of Moses, we're also going to learn that there is just one true God, despite the cultural impact of 400 years of slavery in Egypt. And then they move into the promised land, and they are surrounded by the nations that worship their own plethora of gods in a polytheistic culture. They need to learn there is just the one true God. So Moses has a conversation with his father-in-law named Jethro in Exodus 18. It says, Jethro said, blessed be Yahweh, who has delivered you out of the hands of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Jethro was not a Hebrew. He was a Midian. He was not of the same ethnic background, the same religion. And yet he saw and he observed, and presumably, because of Moses' influence, had come to know who the one true God is. Now I know that the Lord, these are Jethro's words, a pagan, a non-Israelite, making this confessional statement. I know that Yahweh, the Lord, is greater than all gods, because in this affair they have dealt arrogantly with the people. God has dealt compassionately. Therefore I know there is just one true God. So those are some of the things we're going to learn about God in this Exodus. Also, as we look at the life of Moses, we're going to learn about God's people. That God treats them with loyalty, but also expects loyalty from them. We call that faithfulness or holiness. In chapter 19, verse 3, Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, thus shall you say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wing and brought you to myself. Isn't that interesting? Does it say, I brought you out of your slavery. I brought you to the wilderness. No, God views it relationally. I brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession amongst all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. So this concept that God is relational, personal, engaged, and what that means for us as his children. And then finally, also in that same text, that this is our Father's world. That I am the one who owns all of this. For all the earth is mine, says God. So some key ideas. Faith. Faith exists in spite of the miraculous. The miraculous happened around Israel all the time. Crossing the Red Sea, the plagues, the food in the desert, the water from a rock, miracle after miracle after miracle, and yet they continued to struggle to believe in God. Miracles and the supernatural do not convince us of the reality of God. It's an issue of faith. So we're going to learn about what does it mean to have faith in God. Secondly, we're going to learn that the Creator God is engaged. We call that providence. I know I've hammered this a couple of times already this morning, but it's central to the story of Moses' life and the Exodus, because often our circumstances defy the reality of God's engagement, but God is engaged. And third, we are going to learn, because of Moses' honesty and humility, that we share his vulnerabilities and inadequacies. And yet God loves us and desires relationship with us. And we now have a new covenant because of Christ that defines the terms of our relationship with him.